is one way to reach a lot of people who are involved in farming, gardening, kind of anywhere along that spectrum, people who are interested in growing local foods. So with that, we will introduce Sarah. So Sarah is a CSA farmer, so she has community-supported agriculture. She's a vegetable farmer near Buffalo, Minnesota. She grows intensively on 3 acres and has been farming at that site since 2015. She's working to create a small-scale, closed-loop system with vegetables as well as herbs and poultry for egg production. So she's worked at farms in France, Georgia, and North Dakota, and she's the president of the Sustainable Farming Association's Crow River chapter. She's experienced with restaurants and cottage food production and is an English as a second language as well as a soil health educator. So we're very excited to have Sarah on tonight. She's done this presentation a few times and it's really great. So hopefully you will enjoy it. And so with that, we're going to switch and have Sarah share her slides.
Okay. All right. Can everybody see the slides here? I'm gonna just get going, and if you're having technical difficulties, you can get in touch with Anna. So this is a presentation that I'm doing on behalf of the Sustainable Farming Association. Like Natalie mentioned, I've been at the location where I grow vegetables since 2015, and I got connected with the SFA really from the beginning. And I feel really fortunate that I was introduced to the soil health principles early on, and that helped me get a good foundation going, but I've definitely improved my practices over time. It's really not always easy to implement these practices, but it's fun and interesting, and with a little bit of diligence, I think there's a lot that can be done to improve your soil health no matter what you're working with. Let me go to the next slide. All right, so why is soil health important? I think one of the first things that comes to mind is just reducing inputs on your farm. So if you're having a good foundation of soil health to begin with, you're not going to be needing as many fertilizer inputs. You'll actually find that you'll need fewer inputs for disease or for pest management. So soil health is really a driver of not only profitability on your farm, but it's actually the legacy, and it is what you're going to be leaving behind for future generations. So that's really a couple of reasons why soil health is important. So what is soil health? One definition is the capacity of soil to function, or just simply put, soil function. So everything from cycling nutrients, holding water in the system, promoting a healthy environment, and just overall health of the ecosystem of your farm. So one thing that we are going to be talking about throughout this presentation are the soil health principles. So I will just briefly touch on each of these. So first of all, keep the soil covered, or sometimes you hear this one as armor the soil. Some examples of keeping the soil covered include cover cropping. It looks like a few people have implemented cover crops, but not everybody. So some examples of cover crops that I've used at my farm are oats, buckwheat. They're both really easy ones to implement because they can fit multiple different windows. For example, oats is a good window for in the spring when you're kind of waiting to get some of your summer crops planted, but you maybe don't want to leave your soil bare before your tomatoes, your peppers, cucumbers, etc. Buckwheat is an example of a great summer cover crop. So maybe you've planted your spring lettuce, and after removing that, you want to plant some buckwheat before you maybe plant a fall crop, maybe your fall broccoli crop. The other nice thing about those couple of cover crops is they're fairly easy to terminate. So when you're ready to remove that cover crop, it's not as difficult as something like that might be a perennial, like a clover, that won't be killed during the winter. And I found that buckwheat you can even terminate just very easily, even by stomping on it, or you could even use a board to stomp on it, but it has a nice kind of juicy stem that is easy to incorporate back into your soil. Other ways that you can keep the soil covered besides cover cropping would include mulching, even using occultation, which is a technique of covering with tarps in between your plantings, not only to cover the soil, but even to terminate weeds. So there's a lot of different ways that you can keep the soil covered. Number 2, minimize soil disturbance. And we'll go into some examples of soil disturbance in a little bit here. But any opportunity to reduce tillage or reduce an instance where you're spraying an herbicide or a pesticide is a good way to minimize soil disturbance. So number 3, increase crop diversity. And again, there's a lot of different ways to achieve this. For example, you can interplant some of your vegetables right next to each other if you have a system where you're able to do that with where you can set up so that you can maybe plant your lettuce alongside a broccoli in the spring, for example. Increasing crop diversity can also include crop rotation, so making sure that you're rotating crops on your farm and not planting the same families year after year in the same spot. And there's other ways to increase crop diversity we'll talk about in the next few slides here. So number 4, keep living roots in the soil. One way we already talked about is cover cropping. So if you have a cover crop in your soil in the spring, when you maybe would normally have that bare, that's one way to keep living roots in the soil. Another way to do that would be with perennial plantings. So you could have different perennial strips mixed in with where your annual crop production is. Or you can even keep some perennial cover crops in your soil over the winter, like rye or vetch or other cover crops that may not be as easy to terminate. Again, keep in mind just how you're going to terminate a cover crop if you don't have the equipment to do that. And then number 5, integrate livestock. So this is something that can be a little bit more difficult with fruit and vegetable productions, especially with food safety. But there's other ways, that there's definitely ways that you can integrate livestock. So this might just be using a composted manure, but we'll talk about some other ways that you can do this in the next slides. So before we move on, are there any questions about the soil health principles? Okay. So next we're going to talk a little bit about some of indicators of good soil health. One thing I want to emphasize is that some of this information is somewhat intuitive. So you can kind of pick up your soil in the spring, and we all know what a good soil in the spring smells like, something I'm sure everybody here is looking forward to right now. There's some other kind of intuitive ways that we can test our soil health besides just the smell. For example, an earthworm count is a great way to do this. Just check per square feet, how many earthworms are you finding in your soil? And that's even something that you can record and keep track of from year to year. Some other indications of good soil health are high microbial activity. So again, that's a reason that we want to minimize soil disruption, is because any disruption is going to disrupt the habitat of the microbes that are living in the soil. So having a high microbial activity is really important to be able to cycle nutrients. And also, it's really the way that plants communicate with the soil is through the microbes that are living there. Ability to infiltrate and store water. So how well does your soil absorb water versus is it pooling or running off, which might lead to erosion? Ability to cycle nutrients, how fast is organic matter breaking down in your soil? And then high inorganic matter. And then fungi. So this is another thing similar to the microbes that are in the soil. Fungi will be really easily destroyed if the soil is disrupted too frequently with either tillage or with chemical disruption. And the fungi is really important because this mycelial network actually is acting as an extenders for your plant roots. So they allow the plants to reach deeper into the soil to scavenge for nutrients and water. And this mycelial network is really helping keep that moisture in the soil like a sponge. So I mentioned the first soil health principle is that reducing disruption to the soil. And there's a few different ways that we can disturb our soil. One is through physical compaction or physical tillage. And you can see in this photo with the corn there, you really, when you till the soil, it creates this nice homogeneous seed bed, which at first seems great because you really get that good soil contact with the individual seeds. But really over time, this will cause those soil levels to start to settle. And when the soil starts to settle and become homogenized, it almost gets like a concrete-like texture to it. And this compaction is when we really get standing water or runoff in the soil, which can lead to erosion. So biological, again, lack of plant diversity, we're not providing different roots. And those different roots from different types of plants is really what's providing a well-rounded source of food and nutrients for the soil microbes. So if we only have one type of plant root, we are not providing enough nutrients and different food options to attract different microbes into the soil. And then chemical, of course, so misuse of fertilizer. If we're adding too much fertilizer to our soil, we're almost making the plants kind of lazy because instead of having to find those nutrients for themselves, we're just giving it right to them. They don't have to really do the work to find ways to absorb the nutrients on their own. Pesticides and of course herbicides are really disrupting the soil biology as well. So by adding some of these disturbances, we're making it really difficult for the habitat of the microbes and the fungi to create this underground soil ecosystem. So think of it like a forest or a pond. The soil is really its own ecosystem. So to use these soil health principles are really ways that we're helping promote that diverse ecosystem underfoot that is going to result in an increased plant vitality and just helping the plants have an authentic relationship with the nutrients and the organic matter underground. So here's me from Solar Fresh Produce. I'm going to talk a little bit about some specific practices that I've used at my farm to implement some of these soil health principles. Oftentimes I give this presentation with Josh, but he wasn't able to be here today. He has a farm in Henderson, Minnesota, and I'm going to talk a little bit on his behalf about some of his practices. But before we get into these specific examples, I want to talk a little bit more about some different soil health kind of diagnostics that you can do on your own farm. So I'm going to just, let's see. Just want to make sure everybody's can see these demos here. I'm going to start with the slake test. just because it's kind of interesting to see how that progresses throughout this presentation here. So this is called the slake test, and this is something you can do at your farm just to get a sense of the soil aggregate. And how does your soil react when it's exposed to water or a raise event? Oh, I see we have a question. Let's see, how do I see that question here? Natalie, do you want to jump in and see? Oh, here we go.
Yes, I can't actually see it. I think it went right to you, but if you click on chat, you should be able to see it.
Let's see. I'm not seeing the question still.
I don't see it either.
Okay.
So maybe if you have a question, make sure that when you type it in the chat, it's going to everyone. And then if Sarah's not able to open it,
we'll come back to that. So if you do have a question, feel free to type that in there, and I'll be happy to address that before we move forward and you maybe forget what you were thinking about there. But so again, we're gonna go to some of these diagnostics that you can do at your farms or in your garden just to get a better idea of where your soil health is. And with some of these, we're just really creating a baseline, and then you'll want to take records so that you can come back to it in the future and see how you've improved or what direction things are going. So again, this is called the slake test, and more information about these can be found on the NRCS website. If you just search for NRCS soil health, you'll get a wealth of information about these and other tests, and also how you can do some record keeping for that. So I just constructed this demo out of some half-gallon mason jars and some hardware cloth. And I'm gonna hold these up to the screen. I know it's kind of difficult to see the samples, but this sample is actually from my neighbor's field, and it's just pretty nearby. They use a corn and soybean rotation, and they use pretty heavy tillage. They're doing this tillage about every, twice a year probably, if not more, with cultivation. They use several chemical applications throughout the year for pest management and for fertilizer. And we have very similar soil. Obviously, we're just right next door to each other. And then this is a sample from my hoop house. I should say that the land where I started gardening was also experienced tillage pretty frequently. But as soon as I got there, I made my hoop house a no-till zone, so it hasn't been tilled in about 5 years. And I know it's kind of difficult to see in these examples, but you might notice just some roots in the soil. You might see some holes in the soil, and that's an indication of the aggregate. So I'm going to expose these to some water and just see how the two different soils react. And one thing I want to point out as well is that when you do this slake test, you want to make sure that your clod of soil has been dried out so that you're getting an accurate reaction in the soil. All right, so we'll just let these do their thing here for a little bit, and I'll get a closer look up here to this so you can see the difference. And while we're waiting to see what the reaction is here, I'm going to talk a little bit about another test, which is the infiltration test. So again, another way that you can do some diagnostics at your farm. The infiltration test is a way that you can get a sense of how your farm will react to a 1-inch rain event. So the materials you need for this is, I'm using a soup can today. What the NRCS recommends is a 6-inch diameter sort of vessel, and I've cut the hole out of the top and the bottom so that I can press this down into the soil. And what we want to do is figure out how much water will fill up 1 inch of this of this vessel, whatever size you do. So I did a little bit of math to figure this out. If you do the suggested 6-inch diameter ring to get 1 inch of water, that would be about 440 milliliters. For the soup can, it would be about 135 milliliters of water. And so just to calculate that, if you're interested, you would do the volume of the cylinder, which is pi times the radius squared, and then times the height, in this case 1 inch. And then that gets you cubic inches, so you convert that to milliliters. So then next what you're gonna do is take your ring, and I've marked about up to 3 inches here. So you wanna press this down 3 inches into your soil, and you might need to put a block of wood on your soil when you're doing this at home, and then hammer it down in. In this demo, I'm gonna be able to just press this in 3 inches, hopefully. So, not quite 3 inches. Okay, and then I wanna just press down just around the outside of the ring to create a seal. Hopefully everyone can see this. And then without disturbing kind of the inside of that soil sample. So then I'm gonna take my 135 milliliters of water. And again, what's important is just consistency, because what we're really doing is creating a benchmark for your soil. So if, you know, my measuring cup isn't quite super accurate, but as long as we're getting, you know, something that's gonna be fairly consistent over time. So what I'm gonna do is pour this into the ring here and time how long it takes the soil. So pour this in, 1 inch. We wanna time that and see how long. So that's still infiltrating. And then you'll want to record that in your data sheet to see how long that takes to infiltrate. I'm gonna try and just get a better view of this infiltrating here. So, and once it's at about 50%, if you've got an uneven surface, that's kind of when you want to stop your timer and see. So I'm going to bring it back over to this slake test and see where we're at with this. So again, this sample was the poor soil health, or I should say the tillage and increased soil disruption. Whereas this sample, there is no tillage for at least 5 years and no chemical disruptions and just all organic amendments. So one thing to note is just the clarity of the water. You can see that this water is a lot more cloudy, and that's a good visual of just how soil health impacts our lakes and streams and the quality of water, you know, downriver from our farms or our gardens. You can also see how this sample on the left, the soil is really holding together well. It's not flaking apart. It's maintaining its structure, and that's because it has the capacity to really absorb the water like a sponge, whereas in this case, the soil is not really able to absorb the water. It's you could imagine in a rain event the type of erosion we would experience in this soil compared to this soil. All right, so are there any questions of slake test or the infiltration test before we move on to some other examples of how to implement the soil health principles? And again, that was the NRCS that has a lot of great information on how to do these tests and how to keep some good records of those. All right, so I am gonna go back to the PowerPoint slideshow here. All right. Go to the next slide here. All right, so here's just a couple photos of some cover crops that I used at my farm. And again, I mentioned how oats is a good cover crop to fill in that time frame in the spring between when you maybe have some bare soil and you're waiting to plant your warm weather crops. I planted an oat cover crop here. It says rye and wheat, but I don't know if I actually had the rye and wheat in there. It may have just been oats. And then I used a scythe to terminate that cover crop. So that's just one method of terminating the cover crop, mowing. It won't actually kill the cover crop. What I did then was strip till so that I was able to have kind of a living mulch in between the rows of tomatoes, and then till just where I was going to plant the tomatoes to help reduce that soil disturbance a little bit. So again, promoting biodiversity. This is an example of just showing carrots and onions side by side in the garden. You can also see some purslane there. Whenever I see purslane, I like to leave that, and actually I harvest it for the CSA, and people really seem to enjoy it. And it's a good way to just keep that soil covered until you want to pull that out before it takes too much space or too much nutrients from your actual vegetables. But just increasing that crop diversity, growing different crops right next to each other in your gardens or on your farm. So this is at Josh's farm, and he's a little bit larger scale than I am, and he has more tractors and more land to kind of work with when he's doing his, crop planting. So on the left there is the hairy vetch cover crop. I think he included his dog there for scale to see. And I know what he did there was disc in that winter squash. I believe his first planting did end up getting washed out, and he managed to replant, and even though it was a little bit late, he had a really great harvest of winter squash there. That picture on the right is his, another picture at his farm where he used, I believe that's, you have Brussels sprouts there, and then alternating with rows of cover crop, hairy vetch as the cover crop. And what he does is rotates year to year. So next year after this picture, he would have that hairy vetch planted where the Brussels sprouts was and plant the Brussels sprouts where the hairy vetch is. And then mulching. So be resourceful with mulching. You can use what you have. Just try to find something, of course, that doesn't have a lot of weed seeds in it. It does take a while to break down. I found that it's kind of a sweet spot of you don't want your mulch to be too thick that you're overheating the soil or creating an environment for diseases that can grow in there. So keeping that mulch a little bit fluffy, making sure it's thick enough to suppress weeds, but not too thick that there's not enough airflow to the roots of the plants. And I've used things like newspaper. You can use grass clippings, just mulching with different things that you have around to keep that soil covered and suppress weeds. This was an example of a no-till potato crop where you really just build up the mulch as you go with the potatoes. Instead of tilling or hilling, you just keep the mulch. You keep the mulch increasing as you're growing the potatoes. Another different technique that I've tried that's been kind of fun and interesting is with using some old garden seed for cover crops. So what I do is at the beginning or end of the season, I go through my seeds, and if there's anything that I don't think I'm going to plant again, or there's maybe not enough to grow a whole crop up for the CSA, I'll just mix those seeds together instead of having them kind of in a box somewhere. And one thing I found with this is you can see in the photo there's some bean seeds in there, different size seeds, but if you're gonna run it through a seeder, it's actually kind of nice if you use seeds of similar size. Also, try to avoid seeds that you maybe have disease issues with. So if, I usually avoid cucurbits and solanaceous seeds, tomatoes, cucumbers, anything like that. And also think about your crop rotation. So don't use seeds that you're maybe going to be planting that crop in the next planting. But things like lettuce, beets, Swiss chard, cilantro I've used in there, different like carrot seeds, anything that, you know, even might be harvestable. So in the picture there on the right, I had incorporated some oat seeds, but I decided the next year when I was doing that to not include those just because I wanted it to be something I harvested. So after my cucumbers were done for the year, I pulled those out, and instead of leaving the soil bare, I planted this diverse cover crop mix. And then it actually was a great way to get some fall greens harvested for the CSA. So just a different way you can use those. In that picture, I incorporated it with the squash planting. But that's something that you can think about as a way to, again, use what you have on hand, increase crop diversity, and keep the soil covered. So interplanting is another thing on my small scale farm that I'm a big fan of, because not only does it help me use a diverse mix of plants in a small space, it also helps suppress weeds. And I've also had some pest management benefits. So you can see that picture on the left. When I transplant my cucumber plants, I'll direct seed a ring of radish seeds around those cucumbers. And that acts as kind of a first line of defense against pests. I can kind of see if they're gonna go there first before they get to the cucumbers. Those radishes also really help hold in moisture for the cucumber plants, which really need quite a bit of moisture. And they keep the soil shaded and suppress weeds. And then I harvest those radishes, and the timing works out just about right when the cucumbers are needing more space to spread out and start to vine. Is about the right time to pull those radishes and harvest them and use them for the CSA. And you can see up in the upper right hand corner there, the broccoli alongside with some, I believe that's arugula and radicchio. And again, just using different plants to attract different microbes. Vegetables in the cole crop family or the brassica family, such as broccoli or radishes or cabbages, don't have as robust of relationships with soil microbes. So it's a great idea if you can bring some lettuce or some other types of crops that will help attract beneficial microbes to that area of your garden. So those are just some ideas to kind of get the wheels turning of how you can increase crop diversity, keep the soil covered, and also get some good harvestable crops from your garden if you're working in a small space. Here's another good example of interplanting. So some onions and lettuce mixed in together, a lot of similar benefits. And then here's some examples of the Three Sisters garden. Has anybody tried the Three Sisters garden? If you want to use that yes or no feature on your slides there, and just let me know if you've used that Three Sisters model before. It's a really fun way to get kids involved, but it also has great success rate. So the Three Sisters garden is corn, beans, and squash, and they all have complementary benefits. I planted my corn first. Once that sprouted, I got my beans planted, and then once the beans sprouted, I planted the squash. And it's a great polyculture, as it says there on the slides. It helps in theory, with weed suppression. Not always a perfect example. I was still doing quite a bit of weed management by hand. I had the challenge of just a low germination rate on the squash. So unfortunately, I didn't get to see the full fruition of that method. But once the squash does grow, those big leaves will help protect the corn from predators like deer or raccoons, but also help suppress weeds and keep that soil shaded. And I know I've talked to other farmers that have had success with this Three Sisters method as well. So Looks like we've got a few people that have tried that Three Sisters planting method in the past. Okay. All right, and then some of these slides are showing up sideways here for some reason, but this was again on Josh's farm. So you can see that photo on the left if you're able to make that out there. There was his tomato planting, and what happened was he missed a cultivation window, and he had some weeds growing up in between his tomatoes. I know he says that was when he was using plastic mulch, although he doesn't use that anymore. But at the time, he ended up just mowing those grasses down that were wanting to cover the soil anyway, and just use that as kind of a living mulch. Many of you have had problems with diseases in your tomato. A lot of times, those tomato diseases are from the splash up from the soil. And having a living mulch in between your rows will, or even just a straw mulch will help with the soil splashing, and that can help so you're having cleaner produce and also not having to worry about as much disease transmission. And then there's Josh on the right baling hay that I know he uses that on his farm for mulch, and kind of again just use what you have available and keep that soil covered with mulch or whatever you're able to do. Even if it's just weeds, you might have to just mow those down. And the important thing is to not let the weeds go to seed. I know that's been a major struggle for me with my soil. I have really rich soil, and trying to reduce tillage and implement these soil health practices, weed suppression has definitely been my #1 challenge. So just working on trying to get those weeds back before they do go to seed. And, you know, year after year, if you're not disrupting the soil, you're not going to be disrupting the seed bed and hopefully not pulling up new weed seeds to the surface. And it is a bit of a process, so it takes time, it takes some patience. But I definitely have seen benefits from using these principles. So again, here's another example of cover cropping, an overwintered cover crop, so a rye vetch mix, seeded in August. And then in spring, depending on what you're trying to achieve, you can either mow or till that. And again, one thing to keep in mind is just, you know, how are you going to terminate that cover crop? If you don't have a way to till that in or a good way to mow the cover crop, a typical lawnmower might not cut it. A scythe might be a good option, but on a larger scale, that might not be an option. So just keep that in mind, how you're going to do that, and kind of think ahead on what you're going to do to manage that cover crop down the row. All right, so we briefly talked about incorporating animals and livestock in your soil. I got chickens on my farm this year, about a year ago, I should say, and I'm still trying to figure out good ways to manage the soil, or I'm sorry, the produce safety, but also get the full benefit of the grazing of the chickens. And one way to go about that is with a chicken tractor. They're an easy way to build. They do require a bit of management, moving those chickens around, depending on how you want to manage your soil. You might not want to overgraze, so you have to do it kind of at the right timing, and it might take a while to get a feel for that. Hogs is another way to incorporate livestock. They really help breaking up soil compaction. They can dig out roots and rocks in your soil if that's something that you're dealing with. But again, just make sure that you're keeping your livestock separate from your gardens, because you want to make sure that you don't have any raw manure near anywhere that you're going to be harvesting your vegetables. So that's something to keep in mind as you're incorporating livestock. And there's other ways to incorporate livestock, like we mentioned, applying a well-composted manure. Just make sure if you're applying a raw manure, you really want to give that a chance to kind of age on the soil after you apply that. So doing that in the fall. If you have access to a tested, really well composted manure, that's going to be your best bet for incorporating livestock into the soil. And we're really seeing how there's a special relationship between animals and the land that we just can't replicate without having that interaction present. So we're learning a lot more about that. And if there's a way that you can implement that on your farm, you will really get the maximum benefits by incorporating livestock into your operation. I'm hoping to work with some more managed grazing around the farm, and then just to get that the benefits of the manure from the chickens on the farm, but making sure to just manage, you know, hopefully no excessive nitrogen, etc. So here's some equipment. I don't use a lot of heavy equipment, mostly just a broad fork is a great tool. A small walk behind tiller is a great tool. And of course, we're trying to reduce tillage, but if you are going to use that, which it does take time to build up to a no-till system, just make sure when you do till, you're conscious of when you're doing that. So you don't want the soil to be too wet or too dry, and it takes a little practice to figure out when that sweet spot is. But tilling the soil while it's too wet can really do a lot of damage and increase the compaction. And also, if you are tilling, just set that up to a shallow depth so you're not going down too deep and you're not disrupting the soil. Again, we already touched on this a little bit, just the manure. There are non-manure inputs, fish fertilizer, a compost tea is something, a nettle tea is something that I've actually used with good results. I've really enjoyed the results of doing that. Just applying a fermented compost or a fermented nettle tea, and that's something you can find a little bit of information online, but again, takes a little bit of trial and error to figure out. I usually let that ferment for about usually a couple weeks depending on the temperature. But there's other ways you can go about fertilizing if you're not, you know, using animal or manure inputs. So again, soil health is really strongly related to soil health. The soil is really the gut or digestive system of our planet. So focusing on soil health is going to lead to great benefits that might take a little bit of time to start to see and a little bit of diligence, but it's definitely worth the effort. And before we open it up to questions here, I just want to stop this sharing and just show you again the results of this slate test here. So again, it kind of goes without saying, but here we're looking at our poor health, which we've kind of gotten down to almost a, I'll just hold this up to the camera so we can get a better look at that. Oh, we're really losing all of our soil here. So we've got really cloudy water, and that clod is pretty much gone here. And again, not perfection. There's always room for improvement, but this sample with, I'm going to agitate this a little bit so we can just see, you know, there's still room for improvement, but we can see a major difference in the clarity of the water and how well that soil clod is holding together and able to absorb the water more like a sponge. All right. So with that, I think we have about 10 minutes left here for questions. I'd love to hear if anybody has, oh, and I see we do have some good chat going on the side there. Let me just see if I can kind of go through. Sorry, I didn't get to those throughout. Figuring out the water amounts used. Let me see. I'm gonna just pull that up here, and they do have some great ways to, or some great worksheets, I should say, on those. That, let me see. I'm gonna just share my screen here again so that you can see the. Maybe I'll share my screen. Let's see. So here, I found this, I just searched the soil infiltration test, and if you go to this soil quality test kits, that gives you worksheets on how to do these different presentations, and there's also an Excel spreadsheet that you can download I believe it's this soil quality evaluation worksheet that you can download to keep records, but you could probably find or make a little bit simpler sheet as well. And then this infiltration test talks a little bit more about that. Again, the equation is just pi times the radius squared times 1. So you'll just find the radius of your vessel, then do that by squared times pi, and then that gets you the cubic inches. And I honestly just went online and just Googled how to convert the cubic inches to, milliliters. Okay, and then the Tres Hermanas, an old Mexican tradition, plastic covering is not a wise use of organic gardening. Yeah, I agree. I try to avoid plastic mulch if possible. So let's see, how long after having animals on the land would it be appropriate to plant vegetables safely? So a good resource for this is the produce safety program. And I want to say it's around 200 days. I don't know if Natalie, if you can, oh, yep, you responded here. 90 days, okay, 90 to 120 days. So for foods that don't directly touch the ground, and then 120 for anything that touches soil, so. All right, were there any other questions? So with the little bit of time that we have remaining, I'm just kind of curious to see if people would like to respond. How many people think that they will try one of the slake tests or the infiltration tests at home in their gardens this year as a soil health measure? All right, we've got well, at least six people here that think they're going to try those. One thing to mention is that with the infiltration test, a good way to keep a record of that is just to take a picture and then keep that with your records where you maybe keep your infiltration test data. So, are there any other questions about the soil health principles, or what is soil health, or how to do any of these diagnostics at home?
Right. If there are no other questions, I have a couple of slides just to wrap up and make some announcements for next week. So did you have any kind of final thoughts or statements, Sarah?
Thank you everyone for coming, and I hope you learned something, and just keep in mind that, like I mentioned, it can be a little difficult to implement these principles. Maybe just choose one or a few practices to start with and build up from there. Don't think that you need to switch over all at once, but it's really interesting to kind of use these things out and just shift your way of thinking about your soil and keep that really in mind in the back of your head as you're making decisions at your farm. So thank you for your participation, and I hope that you learned something.
All right, thanks so much, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you.
So if you want to stop sharing, I will just quickly share my screen to make these final announcements. Oh, you're not sharing. Okay. There we go. So just a couple of follow-up points. Please do fill out the evaluation. You should be getting that in an email. Again, that gives Sarah some feedback. That also helps us to figure out how we can do this better in the future. It gives us ideas for future topics. You can follow the Local Foods College on Facebook or Twitter. And again, you can go back and watch all of these recordings later on. Next week, again, we're going to be doing this at 5 o'clock instead of 6 o'clock so that people can caucus. And the topic for next week will be very related to this one. So this was about soil health. Next week is going to be about soil still, but more related to nutrient management. And so Paolo Pagliari is an extension soil scientist, and he's going to be talking about how to collect soil samples. Basically, why are soil tests so important? How can they help you to grow food better? And then how to actually interpret a soil test. So when you send samples into a soil lab, the report that you get back can be a little bit confusing. And so he's going to kind of walk through that and walk you through how to actually make management decisions based on that soil test. So tune in for that next week if you're interested. And with that, we will wrap up for today. So thank you again to Sarah for the great presentation. Thank you for everybody for joining.